Cuba's leader at the time, Fulgencio Batista, depended heavily on American support to stay in power, and as a result, he quickly followed the U.S. when it declared war on the Axis powers. Cuba declared war against Japan on December 9, 1941, and against Germany on December 11, 1941. Cuba was a large producer and supplier of sugar to the Allied forces. Although a conscription law was passed and men were being registered for military service in Cuba, Cuban troops were not sent overseas to participate in combat. Cuba had already been the site of many U.S. naval bases and other military installations, and during the war, even more establishments were approved and built. During the Cuban sugar boom in the early 1920s, many Japanese and Okinawan workers were recruited to meet the labor shortages. Others sought to get into North America, but due to restrictive immigration measures, the Japanese could not enter, and so instead they went to Cuba, hoping that they could later migrate to the U.S. When the U.S. declared war on Japan, all Japanese and Okinawan males, heads of the families, were imprisoned, leaving their families to fend for themselves.
During the time of the Jewish Holocaust, Cuba did nothing to help the refugees. When the St. Louis, a refugee boat containing 938 Jews, arrived in Cuba on March 27, 1939, only 28 Jews were allowed to enter Cuba, leaving 908 Jews to fend for themselves. Many of the Jews had legitimate documents to enter Cuba, but before their arrival, Cuban President Federico Laredo Bru issued a government decree that invalidated all recent land certificates. Cuba also required the refugees to give a payment of $500 in order to enter Cuba. This action by Cuba left many Jewish refugees aboard the St. Louis helpless, since they did not have the time nor the money to enter Cuba through the new terms.
The first leader of Cuba during World War II was Fulgencio Batista from 1940 to 1944. He took power from Grau San Martin, leader of the opposition forces. Once Batista gained power, he and former political leader Federico Laredo sought to instill new social and economic reforms in Cuba. This led to a new constitution which helped to decrease political tension in the country. Cuba also declared war on Germany, Italy, and Japan in December 1941. In 1944, the next presidential election was held in which Grau San Martin won. However, San Martin's tenure was marked by disaster and, most famously, food shortages. Despite this, San Martin regained popularity by reaching an economic agreement with the United States for an increased price of sugar. In the post-war period, according to social and economic indicators, Cuba was a leader amongst the Latin American countries. In 1948, Primo Socaras from the Cuban Revolutionary Party won, but his failing to live up to the revolution ideals doomed him.
Women in Cuba have always been looked down upon. They were dependent on men and held them responsible for the safety and protection of them and their families. Women had inferior legal status and limited rights. They had no rights to control property unless they became widows. Cuban women, just like any other female in the United States and any other country during this time, were seen as weak individuals and working in the confinements of their home. But during the 1940s, Cuba attempted to progress and stabilize their economy. Women have started to have better housing, and some had enough money to pay for domestic servants. They also sent their children to universities where they would enhance their education and get better paid jobs. Also, more Jewish women became active in the Zionist organization. Many minorities existed during the war and still exist today. The two that were affected the most by the war are the Jewish and the Afro-Cubans, or also known as the colored people of Cuba. Jewish were always seen as weak and for a long time have been treated poorly. The Afro-Cubans worked very hard to try and support their children. Many also tried to get jobs and be more engaged in domestic services and agriculture. After World War II, the discrimination itself has ceased but are still seen as minorities. As for women, I would like to say that after the war, things worked out for the better and altogether a work in progress.
Cuba joined the United Nations on October 24, 1945. Although the United Nations was formed on June 26, 1945, the official ratification of this organization did not occur until October 24, 1945, which makes Cuba one of the original members.